The sun was just beginning to rise over the rolling hills of Greenfield Acres, casting a golden glow over the vast expanse of cornfields that had been in the Thompson family for generations. John Thompson, a sturdy man in his late 50s with weathered hands and a heart full of pride, stood at the edge of his field, surveying the fruits of his labor. The corn was tall, almost 8 feet, and the golden tassels swayed gently in the morning breeze. It was going to be a good harvest, one that would finally allow him to pay off the new irrigation system and maybe even put some money aside for his granddaughter Emily's college fund. John's grandfather, Samuel Thompson, had purchased these 200 acres back in 1935 during the darkest days of the Great Depression. Samuel had worked double shifts at the local factory, SAVYing every penny to buy this land. He had dreamed of a future where his family would never go hungry, where they would always have a place to call home. That dream had been passed down through the generations, and John had spent his entire life working the land, just as his father and grandfather had before him. But things had changed over the years. The once open countryside had been replaced by sprawling sub-VY signs, each one more luxurious than the last. The latest addition was Maplewood Heights, a gated community of McMansions with 3-car garages, manicured lawns, and streets named after European royalty. John had tried to be a good neighbor, maintaining a buffer zone of wildflowers between his fields and their properties, even allowing them to use his north field for their community events. But the arrival of the new HOA president, Margaret Langston, had turned everything upside down. Margaret was a former corporate executive with a penchant for control and a complete disregard for anything that didn't fit her VY shown of suburban perfection. From the moment she took office, she had made it clear that she saw John's farm as an eyesore, a blight on the otherwise pristine landscape of Maplewood Heights. The complaint started almost immediately as tractors were too loud, the dust from the fields was unacceptable, and the occasional smell of natural fertilizer was an affront to her delicate sensibilities. John had tried to reason with her, inviting her to sit the farm, to see firsthand the hard work and dedication that went into feeding the community. But she had dismissed him with a wave of her hand, saying her time was too valuable for agricultural tourism. It was a warning sign, one that John had foolishly ignored. It happened on a crisp September morning, just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. John was out in the southeast field, checking the moisture levels in the soil. The corn was perfect that year, thick and golden, a testament to the hard work and dedication of the Thompson family. John was feeling optimistic, a rare feeling after years of drought and flooding. That's when he heard the unmistakable roar of an engine, not the steady rumble of farm equipment, but the aggressive snarl of something built for speed and power. At first, he thought it might be one of the neighborhood teenagers joyriding through the fields. But as he crested the rise between the fields, his heart sank. A bright red Jeep Wrangler, with oversized tires and vanity plates that read HOA 1, was tearing through his prime cornfield, mowing down row after row of fully mature corn. The driver wasn't lost or confused. They were deliberately destroying his livelihood. John's hands shook with a mixture of shock and rage as he radioed his son, Michael, who was working in the north section. "Michael, get down here now. Someone's DRIVYing through the southeast corn." By the time Michael arrived in his pickup truck, the Jeep had finally come to a stop, not out of consideration, but because it had gotten stuck in a muddy depression where the irrigation line ran. Nearly 3 acres of corn lay flattened in its wake, more than due law 35,000 worth of crops destroyed in a matter of minutes. As they approached the Jeep, the driver's door swung open, and out stepped Margaret Langston. She was impeccably dressed in a crisp white blazer with the Maplewood Heights logo embroidered on the pocket, pressed khaki pants, and brand-new hiking boots that had clearly never seen a day of actual trail use. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, not a strand out of place despite the vehicular rampage. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" John shouted, his voice trembling with anger. Margaret brushed a piece of corn silk from her sleeve with manicured fingers and replied with chilling casualness, "I'm conducting an official HOA property line inspection. We've had complaints about your farming encroaching on community land." "Michael, normally the calm one in the family, exploded. There's a Sayre VYC road around the perimeter specifically for access. You've just destroyed our entire southeast section. Margaret rolled her eyes, as if they were children overreacting to a minor inconvenience. The HOA has every right to access and inspect our boundaries. Your outdated farming operation is affecting our residents' quality of life and property values. This needed to be addressed. When John pointed out that she was trespassing and had caused significant criminal damage to their crops, she actually laughed. Trespassing? Please. I'm ensuring compliance with our community standards. She reached into her blazer pocket and handed John her business card. Send any concerns to our legal department. This is simply a boundary dispute. With that, she turned her back on them and pulled out her phone, completely dismissing the destruction surrounding her. John heard her call a towing Sayre VYC, GIVY-ing her location as the edge of Thompson Farm, where it met Maplewood Heights property. The tow truck arrived 30 minutes later, bringing with it 2 more HOA board members who stood with their arms crossed, looking at John and Michael as if they were the problem. The extraction of Margaret's stuck Jeep caused even more damage, tearing up additional rows of corn and digging deep ruts in the soil that would take seasons to repair. As she was Leah VYing, Margaret delivered a final insult. Oh, and we'll be sending you a bill for the towing. Your poorly maintained field damaged my vehicle's undercarriage. You really should post warning signs about the irrigation ditches. That night, John couldn't sleep. 3 acres of prime corn gone, 35,000, a fin commercial entitled Women's Joyride. Thesheriff had come out, taken photos, and filed report, Buthicoletta Taysai v. Weil Matter, despite the clear destruction off property. John Cincher and Sagister estimated that Imagete 35,000, a fin commercial entitled Women's Joyride. Thesheriff had come out, taken photos, and filed report, Buthicoletta Taysai v. Weil Matter, despite the clear destruction off property. John Cincher and Sagister estimated that Imagete 35,000 for lost crops, plus at least ULA 5,000 for soil remediation to repair the compacted ruts. John spent the next 3 days in a fog of anger and helplessness. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by the sickening realization that Margaret would likely face no real consequences. The HOA had better lawyers than he could afford, and they would drag out any CIVYL suit until he ran out of money or patience. On the 4th day, Michael suggested their VYEU all their property documents to prepare for a potential legal battle. We need to know exactly where our boundaries are, Dad. If she's claiming we encroached on their land, we need to prove her wrong. It seemed like busy work to distract John from his anger, but he agreed. They pulled out every document related to the farm deeds, surveys, tax records, the original sale documents from when the developers bought the adjacent property from Maplewood Heights. John even drove to the county records office to retrieve the original plat maps from when the Subby VY Shown was approved. What he discovered made his heart race like it hadn't since the day he proposed to his wife, Mary, 40 years ago. When they built Maplewood Heights, the developer had made a catastrophic error. Their crown jewel, a 12,000-square-foot clubhouse with an infinity pool, tennis courts, and fitness center, was built partially on a 2.8-acre parcel that legally belonged to John. The parcel had a complicated history. In 1962, John's father had briefly sold it to his uncle during a difficult financial period with a buyback agreement. 2 years later, it was deeded back to the Thompson family, but this transaction created a separate legal description in the county records. When the developers conducted their survey 15 years ago, they had somehow missed this separate parcel entirely. Their fancy clubhouse, the heart of the community and the feature most prominently displayed in their marketing materials, encroached a full 75 feet onto John's land. The eastern wall of the main building, half their infinity pool, and one entire tennis court were sitting on property that had been in the Thompson family for generations. John could hardly believe it. He checked and rechecked the surveys, comparing the original property descriptions with the current county GIS maps. There was no mistake. The so-called premier amenity of Maplewood Heights was trespassing on his land far more significantly than his corn had ever encroached on theirs. John called Samuel Richardson, the attorney who had represented the Thompson family for decades. Samuel verified John's findings and was astonished. "John, this isn't a minor encroachment. They built a $1 million facility partially on your land, without permission or compensation. You have full legal rights to demand its removal. What about getting compensated for my crops?" John asked. "The crop damage gives you leverage, but this clubhouse situation..." Samuel whistled through his teeth. "That's your nuclear option. They'll fight the crop damage claim, but they can't argue with property deeds and surveys recorded at the county level." For the first time since watching Margaret's Jeep flatten his corn, John felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about respect for boundaries, for property rights, for the agricultural heritage that had sustained this community long before fancy sub-DVY signs arrived. Armed with certified surveys, property deeds, and a letter from Samuel outlining his legal position, John requested an emergency meeting with the HOA board. They reluctantly agreed, probably expecting him to beg for compensation for his damaged crops. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Tuesday in the very clubhouse that sat partially on his land. 5 board members waited at a mahogany table in their executive conference room, with Margaret at the head, looking annoyed at what she called unnecessary drama. When John walked in with his folder of documents, Margaret began with practiced condescension. "Mr. Thompson, we understand you're upset about our necessary property line inspection, but this meeting is merely a courtesy. Our legal team has determined." John cut her off by spreading the certified survey maps across their polished table. "Before you continue, I should inform you that you're all currently trespassing," he said calmly. The room went silent. Margaret blinked rapidly, the first sign of uncertainty John had ever seen on her face. "What exactly are you implying?" asked James Wilson, the HOA VYC president, a retired engineer who had always been CIVYL in their few interactions. John explained the situation methodically. Their clubhouse, their community showpiece, was built illegally on his land. He owned the ground beneath half the building, including most of their infinity pool and the eastern tennis court. "That's absurd," Margaret snapped, her composure cracking. "The developer assured us all property lines were verified before construction." "The developer made a critical error," John replied, sliding the certified survey toward her. "This parcel was under a separate deed number due to a temporary transfer within my family in the 1960s. Their surveyors missed it entirely." John turned to look each board member in the eye. "Now you have a choice. Either compensate me fully for my destroyed crops and sign a new agreement respecting my farm's operation, or I'll exercise my legal right to reclaim my property, which means remo-VY-ing everything on it." Margaret laughed nervously, glancing at the other board members for support. "You can't possibly expect to tear down a $1 million clubhouse over some corn." "I've already filed the necessary legal paperwork," John replied, his voice steady. "You have 48 hours to accept my terms, or my bulldozer starts remo-VY-ing what's on my land." James Wilson, the VYC president, leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, John?" John laid out his terms clearly. 50,000 compensation for his destroyed crop sansoil remediation. Margaret sent me to resignation from the board, a formal apology in the community newsletter, annual easement agreement allowing the clubhouse to remain with annual payments off 50,000 compensation for his destroyed crop sansoil remediation. Margaret sent me to resignation from the board, a formal apology in the community newsletter, annual easement agreement allowing the clubhouse to remain with annual payments off 15,000, and a good neighbor policy document, respecting normal farming operations. Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "This is extortion. We'll countersue for harassment." "Please do," John replied calmly. "I look forward to explaining to a judge how you personally destroyed law 35,000 worth of my crops while trespassing, then had the audacity to demand I pay for the towing bill." The board called an emergency executive session, asking John to leave while they discussed. Through the glass doors of the conference room, John could see heated arguments erupting. Margaret was waving her arms, her face red with fury, while James and two other members appeared to be urging caution. The next morning, instead of a settlement offer, John received a certified letter. The HOA was rejecting his preposterous claims and threatened countersuits for fabricating boundary disputes and making terroristic threats against community property. Margaret had convey and said the board to fight rather than negotiate. The letter ended with a warning that any attempt to approach the clubhouse with construction equipment or destructive intent would result in immediate legal action and criminal charges. John called Samuel, who was outraged but not surprised. "They're bluffing, John. The surveys are clear. I'll file for an emergency injunction today, confirming your property rights and the encroachment." 3 days later, they had their day in court. Judge Harriet Michaels, a no-nonsense woman who had grown up on a dairy farm herself, reviewed the documentation and listened to argument from both sides. The HOA's attorney tried to claim adverse possession and public necessity, but these arguments fell apart under the judge's questioning. The encroachment is less than 15 years old, Judge Michaels noted. State law requires 20 years for adverse possession claims. As for public necessity, that applies to government entities, not private homeowners associations. Her ruling was unequivocal. She confirmed that John owned the land, the clubhouse substantially encroached on his property, and he had the legal right to remove the encroachment if they couldn't reach an agreement. The judge gave the HOA one final chance to negotiate in good faith before allowing John to proceed with removal. "I strongly encourage the parties to reach a settlement," she said, looking directly at Margaret. "The law is clear on Mr. Thompson's property rights in this matter." Emboldened by the court ruling, John presented his final offer to the HOA board. $50,000 compensation for his destroyed crop sand soil remediation, Margaret's immediate resignation, a formal apology in the community letter, annual easement agreement allowing the clubhouse to remain within all payments off $50,000 compensation for his destroyed crop sand soil remediation, Margaret's immediate resignation, a formal apology in the community letter, annual easement agreement allowing the clubhouse to remain within all payments off $15,000, and a good neighbor policy respecting normal farming operations. He gave them 24 hours to decide, a deadline the judge had deemed reasonable given the circumstances. That evening, residents began calling John. They had received an emergency HOA email from Margaret, characterizing him as a vindictive farmer trying to extort the community and announcing an emergency assessment of $20,000 per household to fight his fraudulent claims. Several homeowners asked to see John's documentation. When he showed them the surveys, property records, and court order, many were horrified at how Margaret had misrepresented the situation. By midnight, residents were organizing their own emergency meeting without Margaret to discuss the facts and options. When no acceptance came by John's deadline, he had no choice but to follow through. At 7 a.m. the next morning, John drove his yellow Caterpillar D8 Bulldozer down the main road toward the clubhouse. He was flanked by Samuel and the county sheriff, who carried copies of the court order authorizing him to remove encroachments on his property. Word had spread throughout the community, and local news cameras had somehow gotten wind of the situation. Reporters lined the street as homeowners gathered to watch the confrontation unfold. Some looked angry, others curious, and a surprising number seemed supportive of John's position after learning the facts. Margaret stood on the clubhouse steps with 2 security guards, looking both furious and terrified as the rumbling bulldozer approached. She wore the same white blazer as the day she destroyed John's crops, a detail that wasn't lost on him. John positioned the bulldozer at the property line, the engine rumbling. The sheriff approached Margaret with the court order, while Samuel used a bullhorn to announce, "This is your final opportunity to accept Mr. Thompson's reasonable terms before legal removal of the encroachment begins." Margaret snatched the papers and screamed, "You'll regret this. We'll sue you for everything you own." John put the bulldozer in gear and moved forward, the blade lowering toward the corner of the infinity pool. The crowd fell silent as the metal edge made contact with concrete. Water began spilling out as the pool wall cracked under pressure. Jean felt no joy, only the grim satisfaction of justice being served after his own property had been so carelessly destroyed. As the blade touched the clubhouse foundation, a man in a suit came running from the crowd, while VYing frantically. It was James Wilson, the HOA VYC president. "Stop. We accept your terms." The board voted to remove Margaret and accept all conditions. John shut down the bulldozer. The damage was minimal, just a cracked pool corner that could be repaired. James explained that homeowners had held an emergency vote that morning after reviewing the court documents and property records overnight. They had voted 87 fan-tram in favor of Remo VYing Margaret from the board and accepting John's terms. Margaret was escorted from the property by the same security guards who had stood with her moments before. She continued shouting threats of lawsuits against everyone involved as she got in her red Jeep, the same vehicle that had destroyed John's crops. The crowd of residents actually applauded as she drove away, tires squealing on the asphalt. James and the new acting board president, Eleanor Chambers, a retired judge, approached John with hands extended. "On behalf of Maplewood Heights, we offer our sincere apologies for the damage to your crops and the disrespect shown to your property rights," Eleanor said formally. "We accept all your terms and would like to begin rebuilding a relationship of mutual respect." The new board not only agreed to John's original terms, but added pro-VY signs of their own. An annual Farm Heritage Day, where community residents could learn about agriculture, a monthly farmers market in the clubhouse parking lot featuring John's produce and other local growers, educational programs with local schools about farming and food production, and renaming their community park Thompson Fields, in recognition of the Thompson family's agricultural legacy. Within a week, John received full compensation for his damaged crops. The formal apology was published in both the community newsletter and a local newspaper. Most satisfying was the new monument they installed at the community entrance, a bronze plaque honoring the agricultural heritage of the land and acknowledging the Thompson family's contributions since 1935. Margaret sold her house within a month and moved to Florida, where John heard she was already battling with her beachfront condo association over sea turtle lighting restrictions. Meanwhile, the relationship between John's farm and Maplewood Heights had never been better. Residents now understood and appreciated the seasonal rhythms of agriculture. Many volunteered during harvest or brought their grandchildren to learn about farming. The annual Farm Heritage Day had become the community's most popular event, drawing VY ciders from neighboring counties. The farmers market was Thrive VYing, pro-VY Ding John with a reliable direct-to-consumer revenue stream that had actually increased his farm's profitability. Several residents had even started community garden plots where John taught sustainable growing practices. Most importantly, there was mutual respect. The new HOA leadership understood that their luxury homes and John's working farm could coexist when boundaries, both physical and social, were properly recognized. Michael, who had initially wanted John to sue for millions, now admitted that this resolution was better for everyone. "You didn't just win a battle, Dad," he told John recently. "You changed their perspective. That's worth more than money." John smiled. "Sometimes you have to bring a bulldozer to get respect." John stood at the edge of his field, watching the sun rise over Thompson Fields. The corn was tall and golden, just as it had been on that fateful September morning. But now, the fields were surrounded by a community that had learned to appreciate the value of hard work, tradition, and respect. As he turned to walk back to the farmhouse, John noticed a group of children from Maplewood Heights running through the wildflower buffer zone, laughing and playing. One of them, a little girl with blonde pigtails, ran up to him, holding a freshly picked ear of corn. "Mr. Thompson, is this how corn grows?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. John knelt down and smiled. "Yes, it is. And if you take care of the land, it will take care of you." The little girl nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of his words. John knew then that his grandfather's dreamed the dream of a family farm that would endure for generations was alive and well. And as he looked out over the fields, he felt a deep sense of pride. The bulldozer had been a last resort, but it had been necessary. Sometimes you have to stand your ground, even if it means firing up the engine and taking a stand for what's right. For John Thompson, that was a lesson worth teaching not just to his family, but to an entire community. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.